The blanket hit her chest before she could refuse it. Josephine Hale stood at the edge of the frozen creek bed in the dying light of a January evening in 1882, her fingers so numb she could no longer feel the reins of her dead horse tangled around her wrists. The animal had gone down 3 miles back, a broken foreleg that had snapped like dry kindling on a patch of black ice hidden beneath a dusting of snow. She had walked those 3 miles in boots that were never meant for walking, in a coat that was never meant for this kind of cold, and now she stood shaking so violently that her teeth clicked together in a rhythm that had lost all dignity. She had not heard the rider approach. One moment she was alone in the vast white silence of the New Mexico territory, and the next there was a man on a gray horse, looking down at her from beneath a battered hat that had been rained on and dried out so many times it had taken on the permanent shape of resignation. His jaw was dark with several days of beard. His eyes were the color of river granite, unreadable and still, the kind of eyes that had learned long ago not to give anything away. He reached behind him without ceremony, unrolled the saddle blanket tied to the back of his rig, and held it out toward her. She did not take it. She was Josephine Hale, and she had spent the last 4 years surviving on pride alone, and pride was the only thing keeping her upright at this particular moment. "Take it," the man said. His voice was low and rough-edged, the kind of voice that came from years of saying very little and meaning every word of it. "I have seen worse cold." Those 5 words cracked something open in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. Because standing there in the failing New Mexico light, half frozen and furious and terrified, she understood instinctively that those 5 words contained a biography. They contained losses and distances and years spent in places that would ruin a lesser person. They contained a dark past that he was not offering to share, only referencing, the way a man touches a scar through his shirt without pulling it open for examination. She took the blanket, and that was how it began, not with sweetness, not with poetry. With a scratchy wool blanket offered by a man who gave his name only when she asked a second time, and even then he said it the way a man sets down something heavy he has been carrying too long. "Emmett Thatcher," he said. She had no way of knowing then what that name would come to mean to her. She had no way of knowing that the dark past those gray eyes were guarding contained secrets that would force her into the most impossible choice she had ever faced, that trusting him would feel like walking across ice, that the frozen ground between them would thaw in ways she had never anticipated and never could have prepared for. She had no way of knowing that by the time spring came to the territory, she would not be able to imagine a world in which Emmett Thatcher had simply ridden past her on that creek bank. But that is the nature of the moments that change everything. They do not announce themselves. They arrive dressed in ordinary clothing, smelling of wood smoke and horse and cold air, and they hold out a blanket, and the rest of your life begins. To understand how Josephine Hale came to be standing alone on a frozen creek bank in the New Mexico territory in January of 1882, you have to go back 4 years. You have to go back to a morning in Galveston, Texas, when she was 22 years old and she put on her best dress and walked into a lawyer's office and signed her name to a marriage contract with a man she had met exactly twice. His name was Clarence Hale. He was 40 years old, prosperous by the standards of the frontier town of Cimarron, New Mexico, and he had advertised in the Galveston paper for a wife of good character and sound health. Josephine had been both. She had also been recently orphaned, newly penniless after her father's shipping debts came due, and in possession of precisely no other options. She had been clear-eyed about this. She was not a romantic, or at least she had told herself she was not a romantic, and she had understood that her marriage to Clarence Hale was a transaction. She would keep his house and eventually bear his children, and he would provide her with safety and stability, and if love was not on the table, well, plenty of people lived without it. Clarence Hale had turned out to be a cold man in ways that had nothing to do with weather. Not cruel, not violent, but deeply, comprehensively indifferent. He ran a dry goods store in Cimarron with grim efficiency, and he spoke to Josephine the way he spoke to his inventory. He accounted for her. He did not see her. She had endured 3 years of that particular invisibility before Clarence Hale rode out one morning in February of 1881 to check on a property dispute with a neighboring rancher, and was found 2 days later at the bottom of a ravine. The coroner said his horse had thrown him. The rumor in town said something else, though no one could prove anything, and in a place like Cimarron in 1881, proof was often beside the point. The widow Hale, as she was known thereafter, discovered that Clarence's prosperity had been substantially theoretical. The dry goods store had debts. The house had debts. After everything was settled, she had a small amount of cash, a horse, and a letter from Clarence's lawyer informing her that she had 90 days to vacate the premises before the bank took possession. She had spent the better part of a year in Cimarron trying to find her footing. She had taken in sewing. She had kept accounts for 2 different merchants, her handwriting being notably neat and her arithmetic reliable. She had been, by any measure, resourceful. But Cimarron was a town that had strong opinions about widows, and most of those opinions were condescending or predatory or both, and Josephine Hale was neither meek enough to be condescended to without consequence nor unaware enough to avoid the predatory variety. By December of 1881, she had received a letter from a woman named Clara Moss, who had been a girlhood friend in Galveston before Clara married and moved to Santa Fe. Clara wrote that there was work to be had in Santa Fe, bookkeeping work at a mercantile establishment owned by her husband's business partner, and that Josephine was welcome to stay with them while she got established. It was the only door that had opened, so Josephine had walked through it. She had set out on the 2nd day of January 1882 on a horse that was adequate for town roads and disastrously inadequate for the mountain passes between Cimarron and Santa Fe in winter. She had been warned by 3 separate people not to attempt the journey alone. She had noted those warnings and proceeded anyway, because the alternative was to remain in Cimarron and be slowly compressed into nothing by a town that had already decided who she was. The horse had lasted 9 days before the ice on the mountain trail ended everything. So there she was, standing on a frozen creek bank with a dead horse 3 miles behind her and a stranger's blanket around her shoulders, and Emmett Thatcher was looking down at her from his gray horse with an expression that was not quite sympathy and not quite suspicion but somewhere precise between the two. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Santa Fe," she said. Something moved behind those gray eyes, something she could not name yet. "So am I," he said, and he reached down and offered her his hand. She looked at that hand for a long moment. It was a large hand, calloused and scarred across the knuckles in a way that told its own story. A hand that had done hard work and possibly harder things. She looked up at his face, and his face gave her nothing except steadiness, which was, under the circumstances, the thing she needed most. She took his hand and let him pull her up behind him onto the gray horse. They did not speak for the first mile. The horse moved steadily through the snow, and Josephine held the blanket around herself with one hand and held the back of Emmett Thatcher's coat with the other, and she was aware of the warmth of him against the cold air, the solid, unapologetic reality of another human being after 3 days of nothing but white silence and mounting fear. "What is your name?" he asked, not turning around. "Josephine Hale," she said. He nodded as if he was filing that information away in some internal ledger. "Widow?" he asked. She stiffened slightly. "Yes, for about a year." He nodded again. He did not offer condolences, which she appreciated more than she expected to. Condolences from strangers always felt like a kind of performance. "You said you have been through worse cold," she said after another mile had gone by. "Where was that?" There was a pause long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Montana," he said finally. "And before that, Wyoming. And before that, places I do not talk about on a first acquaintance." "We are sharing a horse," she said. "I would argue that qualifies as more than a first acquaintance." She felt rather than saw the shift in him, a slight easing of tension along his shoulders, the ghost of something that might, under the right conditions, become amusement. "Fair enough," he said. "I spent 2 winters in the Wyoming Territory working cattle for a man who thought that adequate shelter for his hands was a matter of perspective. Lost 2 toes to frostbite the first winter. After that, cold stopped frightening me the way it frightens people who have not been touched by it." She sat with that for a moment. Image of a younger Emmett Thatcher, losing pieces of himself to a cold that another man's negligence had imposed on him. The dark past pressing itself through every word he spoke, the hidden cost of years lived at the mercy of other people's decisions. "You are a drifter," she said. It was not an accusation, it was an observation. "I am," he said, "have been for some time." "What takes you to Santa Fe?" Another pause, this one longer. "Business," he said. She recognized that word for what it was. A door being closed gently but firmly. They made camp that night in a shallow canyon where the rock walls cut the wind, and Emmett gathered enough wood to build a fire that she could feel from 10 feet away. He had provisions in his saddlebags, dried beef and hardtack, and a tin of coffee that he brewed with the economy of someone who had made thousands of trail camps and had refined the process to its essential elements. He handed her the coffee first. She noticed that. They sat across the fire from each other, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. She was accustomed to silences that were either hostile or empty. This one had texture to it. "How long were you on the trail before you found me?" she asked. 3 days out of Raton," he said. "Alone." "Always alone," he said. There was no self-pity in it, just fact. But it settled in her chest with a particular weight, the way certain truths do. She studied him across the fire. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she estimated, though the outdoors aged a man in ways that made precision difficult. The lines around his eyes were deep but not harsh. His mouth was set in a natural expression of seriousness that she suspected was not unfriendliness, but rather the accumulated habit of a man who had learned that optimism was expensive. "You did not have to stop," she said. He looked at her then directly, and for a moment the firelight got into those gray eyes and she saw something there that contradicted everything his face was working to conceal. "No," he agreed. "I did not." He looked back at the fire. She pulled the saddle blanket tighter around her shoulders and thought about what it meant, that he had stopped. The morning came in gray and cold, and Emmett was already up when Josephine woke, the fire rebuilt, more coffee made. He had brushed and watered the gray horse, which she noticed he called argent, from the Spanish word for silver, she supposed, though she did not ask. A man and his horse had a language between them that did not require translation. They broke camp efficiently, and Josephine mounted behind him again, and this time the silence between them had the quality of something that had survived a night and found itself still intact. "Tell me about Cimarron," he said when they had been riding for an hour. She told him, carefully at first, the broad outlines, the marriage and the death and the debts and the months of sewing and bookkeeping. Then, as the morning went on and the trail wound through stands of pinon pine dusted with snow, she found herself telling him more. The particular quality of Clarence Hale's indifference, the way the town had closed around her like a fist after Clarence died. The offer from Clara Moss and the decision to take it, and the horse and the ice and the 3 miles she had walked alone, certain at points that she was going to die out there in the white silence. She did not tell him about being afraid. She told him everything else but not that, pride again, the last remaining wall. When she finished, the morning had advanced into something resembling afternoon, and the sun was showing between the clouds. "You are tougher than you look," Emmett said. "Most people are," she said. "They are not," he said, with a certainty that implied he had empirical evidence. "Most people are exactly as tough as they look, sometimes less." She thought about that. "And how tough do I look?" He turned his head slightly, just enough that she could see the edge of his profile. "Like a woman who has been carrying something heavy for a long time," he said, "and has gotten very good at not letting anyone see the weight." The precision of that observation startled her into silence. They reached the town of Mora by late afternoon, and Emmett arranged for a room at the boarding house there. A two-room situation that preserved propriety while allowing for warmth. The boarding house being run by a woman named Senora Archuleta, who had opinions about appearances, but also genuine kindness beneath them. Over supper in the small dining room, shared with two traveling merchants and Senora Archuleta herself, Emmett was different. He was careful and watchful in a way that was almost imperceptible, but that Josephine, having spent several hours pressed against his back reading the subtle language of his body, noticed. He sat with his back to the wall. He clocked every face in the room. He ate with his left hand so that his right remained free. She filed this away. Later, when they had said their careful goodnights in the hallway and she was lying in her narrow bed listening to the wind outside, she found herself turning over everything she knew about Emmett Thatcher and everything she did not know, and the column of things she did not know was considerably longer. He had a dark past. That was beyond question. The knuckle scars, the way he sat with his back to the wall, the business in Santa Fe that he would not name. The sense of a man who had been in places and situations that had required him to develop a particular set of skills that did not belong to a simple cattle hand or a traveling merchant. She thought about the word betrayal. She thought about how it showed on a person's face, or rather how a person who had been profoundly betrayed learned to arrange their face so that it did not show. Emmett Thatcher had that particular arrangement. She thought about trust, about what it meant to trust someone you had known for less than 2 days, about the fact that she was riding behind a stranger through isolated country and sleeping under the same roof and drinking his coffee, and she was not afraid. She was, in fact, something that felt dangerously close to the opposite of afraid. She told herself it was gratitude. She was a practical woman, and gratitude was a practical emotion. She fell asleep convincing herself of this and was not entirely persuaded. The next day brought better weather and better road, and they made good progress. Emmett seemed slightly more at ease out of the confined space of the boarding house, and as the miles went by he began to talk in small, careful increments, the way a man releases pressure from a valve, just enough to prevent explosion. He had grown up in Missouri, he told her, a small farm outside of Springfield. Father dead of fever when Emmett was 12. Mother remarried badly, a man who was charming in public and a different thing entirely in private. Emmett had left at 17 and had not gone back. He had done many things after that. He named some of them. He did not name others. He had spent time as a cattle drover on the Kishom Trail, which accounted for some of the scars. He had spent time as a deputy sheriff in a Wyoming town, which accounted for a different set of scars. He had spent time doing work that he described only as other things, and by the way he said it, she understood that those other things existed in a moral territory that was more complicated than cattle driving or law enforcement. You were not always on the right side of the law, she said. Not a question. He was quiet for long enough that she thought she had pushed too hard. I was always on the side that needed to be on, he said finally. Whether that side was the legal one was sometimes a secondary consideration. That is either a very principled answer or a very convenient one, she said. It is both, he said. At the same time, that is the honest answer. She respected honesty even when it was complicated, perhaps especially when it was complicated. What changed, she asked. I got older, he said. I got tired. I got to a point where every choice seemed to cost more than I could afford. He paused. And someone I trusted used me for purposes I did not understand until it was too late, and I spent 3 years cleaning up the mess that made. There it was. Betrayal, the word she had sensed beneath every sentence he spoke. How long ago? She asked softly. Long enough, he said, in a tone that closed the subject with the finality of a key turning in a lock. She let it close. She was learning the geography of him, which spaces were open and which were not, and she had enough respect for closed spaces to leave them alone. They reached the village of Las Vegas, New Mexico, by that evening, and here something changed. Emmett's watchfulness, which had been constant but manageable, became acute. She noticed him scanning the street when they rode in, noticed him avoiding the main road through town, and taking a longer route that kept them in the narrower side streets. He chose a smaller establishment for their stay that night, a family's extra room rather than a proper boarding house, arranged through a brief negotiation in Spanish that he conducted with quiet fluency. "You are worried about something," she said, when they were in the small courtyard eating the supper the family had provided. He looked at her levelly. "I am always worried about something," he said. "More than usual then," she said. He set down his fork. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that she could not fully decode, something hovering between the desire to tell her and the instinct to protect her by not telling her. "There are men who know I am headed for Santa Fe," he said carefully, "men who would prefer I not arrive." The bottom of her stomach went somewhere complicated. "Why?" "Because of the business I have there," he said. "You are going to have to tell me what that business is," she said. Her voice was steady and she was proud of it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There is a man in Santa Fe named Vernon Creed. He runs a significant portion of the commerce in the territory, legitimate and otherwise. 6 years ago I was employed by him, doing work that I understood to be one thing and that turned out to be another thing entirely. People were hurt because of my participation. I did not know they would be hurt. I should have asked better questions before I agreed. When I found out what had actually happened, I refused to continue. Creed does not respond well to refusals." Josephine sat with this for a moment. "And the business you have with him now?" "I have evidence," Emmett said. "Documents and a witness who is willing to speak. I am taking both to the federal marshal in Santa Fe. Creed has owned the local law in this territory for years. The federal marshal is new, appointed 4 months ago from outside the territory, and Creed has not yet gotten his hooks in." She understood now. The hidden motive beneath the drifting. The reason for the circuitous route, the back streets, the careful lodging choices. He was not a man running away from something. He was a man moving carefully toward something, carrying evidence of crimes that a powerful man would kill to suppress, and the word trap was suddenly very present in her mind. "You took on a passenger knowing this," she said. "You were freezing to death," he said simply. She stared at him. "Emmett." "I considered it," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "Whether it was right to bring you along knowing the risk, but leaving you out there was not a consideration I could sustain." The way he said it, the matter-of-fact impossibility of leaving her, as if leaving her had been a mathematical impossibility, not a moral choice. She did not know what to do with that, so she looked at the courtyard wall and breathed carefully. "Tell me what you need me to do," she said. He looked at her with something in those gray eyes that she had not seen there before. Something that involved being seen by her, recognized, perhaps, as the person he actually was rather than the person the world had decided he was. "Nothing," he said. "I will get you to Santa Fe. That is my intention. And if Creed's men come for you before Santa Fe, then I will handle it, by yourself. That is how I handle most things." She thought about a man who had learned to handle everything by himself, about what that cost over time, about the accumulated weight of never having anyone to hand the heavy thing to, even briefly. "That seems exhausting," she said. Something remarkable happened. Emmett Thatcher smiled. It was small and brief, and it did not take over his whole face, but it was real, and it rearranged everything she thought she knew about what his face was capable of. "It is," he said. They left Las Vegas before dawn the next morning, the sky still black and the air sharp with cold, Emmett having decided that whatever eyes might be watching the town would be less alert in the gray pre-dawn than at any other hour. Josephine asked no questions and mounted behind him without ceremony, and they moved through the empty streets like shadows. She had slept poorly, not from fear exactly, but from the proximity of things she had not expected to feel. She was not a woman who lost herself easily. She had spent 4 years maintaining careful interior distance from everything and everyone, and she was aware that something about Emmett Thatcher was compromising that distance in ways she had not authorized. She thought about what he had said, about evidence and marshals, and a man named Vernon Creed who had used him for purposes he had not agreed to. She thought about the dark past pressing against the present, the way the past always pressed, the way nothing a person had done ever stopped having weight. She thought about betrayal, the kind he had experienced, being trusted and then being used, being made an instrument of harm you had not consented to, and she thought that she understood something of that. Not in the same way, not with the same stakes, but the shape of it. The way you rebuilt yourself afterward. The careful, methodical work of becoming someone whose interior structure could hold again. They rode in the early dark in silence, and her cheek rested against the back of his shoulder because the cold drove her forward and she was tired, and she felt him notice it, felt the barely perceptible change in how he held himself, upright and still, as if he did not want to disturb her. The trouble came at mid-morning, on a stretch of road that ran through a narrow valley between two ridges. Josephine heard it before she saw it, the particular sound of multiple horses moving with purpose. Emmett heard it too. She knew because his whole body changed, that instantaneous shift from alert to ready that she had not seen before but recognized instinctively as the difference between a man being watchful and a man being prepared for action. "Hold on to me," he said, his voice low and completely calm. She locked her arms around his waist. He did not run. He stopped instead, which was the last thing she had expected. He stopped and he turned Argent sideways in the road and he waited, and she understood in that moment that he had made a calculation, that running in this particular terrain would disadvantage him in ways that holding the road would not. 3 riders came over the ridge to the south. They pulled up when they saw Emmett waiting for them, which told her that they had expected to catch him from behind and had not planned for him to be watching. "Thatcher," the lead rider said. He was a big man with a red beard and the particular confidence of someone who had been sent by a powerful person and believed that the power transferred. "You have something that belongs to Mr. Creed." "Mr. Creed does not own evidence of his own crimes," Emmett said, his voice carrying no more emotion than if he were discussing the weather. "He owns most things in this territory," the red-bearded man said, his eyes cut to Josephine, "and you have picked up a complication." The cold in Josephine's chest had nothing to do with temperature. Trap. The word was there. This was a trap, or it was being made into one, her presence being used as leverage, a forced choice that Emmett had not expected when he had picked her up on the creek bank. "She is not a part of this," Emmett said, and his voice dropped a register. "She is now," the red-bearded man said. "She has been riding with you for 3 days. Makes her either a conspirator or a hostage. Mr. Creed's preference would be the latter." Emmett said nothing for a moment that lasted several years, or so it seemed to Josephine, her arms still locked around his waist, feeling his breathing which was slow and deliberate. "Let her ride on," Emmett said. "She has nothing to do with this and you know it. Let her take Argent and ride on and I will come with you without difficulty." The red-bearded man considered this. And in that moment Josephine made a decision. "No," she said. Both Emmett and the red-bearded man looked at her. "No," she said again. Her voice did not shake, which surprised her. "I am not riding on. I am a witness to this conversation. I know the name Vernon Creed, and I know that these men have ridden out from him to intercept Emmett Thatcher and to prevent him from reaching the federal marshal in Santa Fe. If anything happens to either of us, that information will reach the marshal regardless, because I have already committed it to a letter which has been posted." This was not true. She had posted no letter. She had not even known this situation existed in detail until the previous evening. But she said it with the absolute flat certainty of a woman who kept reliable accounts, and the red-bearded man could not know it was a lie. The silence stretched. The 3 men across the road exchanged a look. "Ride on," the red-bearded man said finally. "Tell Creed the situation has complications. He can decide how to proceed." They turned their horses and went back the way they had come, up over the ridge, and then they were gone. Emmett was very still for a moment. Then he said, "You lied to them." "I did," she said. "Convincingly," he said. "I kept my husband's accounts for 3 years," she said. I have some experience with presenting numbers that tell a specific story. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Are you all right?" She realized her hands were shaking. "No," she said, "but I will be." "The letter," he said, "we should actually write it." "And post it." "Yes," she said, "we should." He turned Argent back to the road and they rode on, and she did not release her grip around his waist, and he did not suggest that she should. They reached Mora again by nightfall, having circled back to avoid the road where Creed's men had been. And at the post office, Emmett dictated to Josephine, who wrote in her clear, reliable hand, a detailed letter to the federal marshal's office in Santa Fe, naming Vernon Creed, describing the evidence Emmett was carrying and its nature, and naming the 3 men who had intercepted them on the road. They gave the letter to the postmaster with enough coin to ensure its priority. Standing outside the post office in the cold air, watching the last of the evening light fade from the mountains, Josephine felt a strange settling in her chest, as if by writing the letter they had shifted the balance of something, as if the secret was no longer entirely a secret and therefore slightly less dangerous. Emmett stood beside her, not touching her but close. She could feel the warmth of him in the cold air. "You called it our business," she said. "What?" "When you dictated the letter. You said, quote, 'the business we are carrying to the marshal, our business, not your business.'" He looked at her. The darkness was coming in around them and his face was partly in shadow, but she could see enough. "So I did," he said. She looked up at the mountains, dark against a sky turning purple and deep blue. "I want to understand something," she said. "The evidence you are carrying, if Creed gets hold of it before you reach Santa Fe, what happens?" "The marshal's case collapses," he said. "Creed retains control of the territory's commerce for the foreseeable future. The people who were hurt by his operations continue to be hurt, and the families of those who were killed by his operations receive no justice. And what happens to you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Creed is not a man who forgives a threat, so he would try to kill you." "He would try," Emmett said. She turned to look at him directly. "I want to come with you the rest of the way," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else to go. I am going to Santa Fe in any case. I want to come with you deliberately, knowing what the risks are as a matter of choosing to see this through." He looked at her for a long time. "Why?" he said, and the word was low and rough and held something beneath it, something that had nothing to do with strategy. She thought about the honest answer. The honest answer was that she had not felt like a participant in her own life in 4 years, and the last 3 days had been terrifying and exhausting, and had also, beneath all of that, felt more real than anything since Galveston. The honest answer was that Emmett Thatcher was the first person in 4 years who had spoken to her as if she were an intelligence rather than an inconvenience. The honest answer was something she was not ready to say out loud, so she said the version of it that was also true. "Because it is the right thing to do," she said, "and I have not done enough of those lately." He was quiet. Then he said, "All right," and the word was soft. They stayed 2 nights in Mora, because the storm that had been building to the north arrived in full force and closed the mountain passes for a day and a half, and those 2 days in the warmth of Senora Archuleta's boarding house were the most unexpected stretch of the whole journey. Stuck inside by weather with no road to watch and no riders to watch for, the particular tension that had been holding Emmett together since Las Vegas eased. Not gone, but modulated. And in that modulated space, something else happened. They talked. They talked the way 2 people talk when they have been keeping careful distances, and the weather has dissolved the reasons for distance. They talked in the small dining room over Senora Archuleta's thick coffee and through the windows at the storm. Josephine told him about Galveston, the real Galveston, her father's ships and the smell of the harbor, and the way she had loved books so fiercely as a girl that the local librarian had given her a key. Emmett listened in the way that she had come to recognize as his particular brand of listening, not passive, not polite, but genuinely engaged, following each thread, asking questions at exactly the right moments. He told her about the years working cattle on the Kishom Trail, the particular brotherhood of it, The long drives from Texas to the Kansas railheads, the way the stars looked from the open plains when there was no structure for hundreds of miles in any direction. He had loved that, he said. The bigness of it. The way a person could feel small in the world and not be afraid of it, because small in a big world was just honest proportion. That is a lovely way to think about it, she said. I had a lot of time to think on the trail, he said. Thinking is most of what you do when you are moving cattle. Your hands and your horse know what to do. Your mind is free. She thought about that. What happened after the trail to the brotherhood you described? His expression shifted. Most of them scattered, a few I kept up with for a while. One I lost to a dispute that went wrong in Abilene. He said this with the flatness of old grief, the grief that has been carried so long it no longer peaks but simply persists. 2 more I know of who died in the following years. That kind of life does not keep people long. And then Wyoming, she said. The deputy sheriff. And then Wyoming, he confirmed. That lasted 3 years. It was a reasonably ordered life. I had responsibilities and I was good at them, and then I made a mistake. He stopped. She waited. I trusted a man who I should have seen clearly, he said. He was persuasive and principled seeming, and I was, I suppose, lonely enough to want to believe that he was what he appeared to be. He looked at his hands. I left the sheriff's office to work for him. I thought it was legitimate commerce. Some of it was, enough to disguise the rest. By the time I understood the rest, I had been inside it for 8 months and 3 people had been killed, and a family had been put off their land through fraud. His jaw tightened. That was Creed. That was the beginning of this. Josephine set down her coffee cup carefully. You tried to report it and he threatened you. He did worse than threaten me, Emmett said. He had me arrested on fabricated charges. I spent 6 months in a territorial jail before a federal lawyer with a conscience got the charges dismissed. By that time, the local law was entirely in Creed's pocket and the evidence I had collected was scattered. I spent the next 2 years reconstructing it. She looked at him. This man who had spent years quietly, methodically rebuilding a case against a powerful man while living as a drifter, while appearing to be nothing more than another rootless soul passing through the frontier. The secret under the surface. The hidden purpose under the apparent purposelessness. You have been working toward this for years, she said. Yes, he said. By yourself, she said. Yes, he said. She thought about the cost of that, the particular loneliness of carrying a secret purpose for years, of not being able to tell anyone what you were doing or why, of being seen as one thing while being entirely another. That is why you stopped, she said suddenly. He looked at her. On the creek bank, she said. I was trying to understand it. You are a man moving carefully toward a goal, carrying something valuable and dangerous, trying not to draw attention to yourself. Stopping to help a stranded woman is the opposite of all of that. It is the kind of thing that draws attention. It slows you down. It complicates everything. She looked at him. But you stopped. He held her gaze for a moment that felt much longer than it was. You were alone in the cold, he said. What kind of man would I be if I had passed you by? She thought about Clarence Hale, who had been many kinds of man and none of them the one who stopped. A different kind, she said quietly. The storm broke on the second afternoon and they left the following dawn. 2 days remaining between them and Santa Fe, and the air between them was different now, charged with things that had been said and things that had not been said, and the persistent awareness of each other that had grown quietly and steadily from the first moment she had taken his blanket. The road south from Mora wound through beautiful country, the mountains dropping away into a broader valley, the sky enormous overhead, the winter sun bright and cold. They shared the saddle still, Josephine behind him, and the ease of it had become something else, less functional and more deliberate, both of them aware of the closeness without acknowledging it. On the first night, camped in a sheltered draw with a fire going, Josephine said, Will you tell me something? Depends on the something, he said. What do you intend to do after Santa Fe, she said. After the marshal has the evidence, after Creed is dealt with, what does Emmett Thatcher do then? He poked the fire with a stick. Sparks rose and dissipated. "I do not know," he said, and the honesty of it was startling, the way the honesty of a man who rarely admits uncertainty lands hard. For a long time, getting to Santa Fe was the end of the road in my mind. Everything after it was just white, like snow. He looked at the fire. "I suppose that is not unusual for a man who has been working toward one thing for years. The thing occupies all the space." "And now," she said. He looked at her across the fire, and the look was direct and uncalculated, which she had come to understand was rare for him. "Now it does not feel entirely white," he said. "There are a few things starting to appear in it." The fire popped. She felt warmth that was not from the fire. "I would like to read again," he said. "Properly. I read when I can, but it is difficult on the trail. I would like a shelf of books and time to sit with them." He said this carefully, as if naming a thing too long denied. "What kind of books?" she said. "History," he said, "and the kind of novels that tell the truth about how people actually are, not the kind that tell you how they ought to be." She thought about the Galveston Library, the librarian's key. "I know what you mean," she said. "I read everything I could find when I was a girl. My father called it my one extravagance." She smiled at the memory. "He was a practical man. He wanted me to read useful things. I read everything anyway." "What was your favorite?" Emmett asked. "George Eliot," she said without hesitation. "Middlemarch specifically. Have you read it?" He shook his head. "It is a novel about people who want their lives to be meaningful," she said. "And about how the world makes that difficult, and about the small, unhistorical acts that actually hold things together. That is the bit that has stayed with me. The small, unhistorical acts." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a kind way of describing what most of us actually do," he said. "I think that was her intention," Josephine said. They sat with that in companionable silence while the fire burned down, and then Josephine said, "I would like to find something too, after Santa Fe. Something that is mine. The bookkeeping in Santa Fe is a start, but I would like something that grows." "You are capable of something that grows," he said simply. She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Because you walked 3 miles alone in killing cold toward a destination you could not see," he said. "And you posted a letter in the dark that did not exist yet. And you told a lie to 3 armed men with the calm of a woman giving evidence in court." He looked at her levelly. "I know it the way I know other things, by watching." She did not have an answer to that. She looked at the fire and felt something moving through her chest, slow and warm and impossible to name accurately without terrifying herself. "We should sleep," she said. "Yes," he said, but neither of them moved immediately. The next day passed in a conversation that felt like the continuation of something that had been going on for much longer than 3 days, as if they were picking up a discussion that had been briefly interrupted, not beginning one for the first time. They talked about books and about the territory and about the nature of justice in a place where formal law was still being assembled from its components. They talked about her father and about his mother and about the gap between who our parents wanted us to be and who we actually were. At one point she said, "Do you ever regret not going back to Missouri?" "My mother died 4 years ago," he said. "I found out 3 months after the fact." By letter he was quiet. "I regret that I was not there, but I do not regret leaving. Leaving was the thing that allowed me to become whoever I am now, whatever that is, rather than whatever that house and that man and that town would have made of me." "I think whoever you are now is someone worth being," she said, and she said it looking directly at him, not shying from it. He held her gaze for a long moment. "Josephine," he said, and her name in his mouth was a different thing than it was anywhere else. It was careful and deliberate and weighted with something that made her heart beat entirely too fast for a practical woman. "Yes," she said, equally careful. "When this is done," he said. "When we have reached Santa Fe and the marshal has what he needs, I would like to call on you properly." He said it plainly, the way he said everything without ornament. "If that is something you would be open to." The question sat in the bright, cold air between them. She thought about what it meant. She thought about all the reasonable, cautious things a woman in her position ought to think about. She thought about the 4 years of careful distance and the accumulated cost of it. She thought about a man who had ridden through cold and dark toward a distant justice and had still stopped for her, who had given her his blanket, who had smiled at her joke about bookkeeping, who had named his horse with a silver word and whose gray eyes held more than they showed. "Yes," she said, "that is something I would be open to." Something in him eased. It was subtle, but she saw it, the smallest loosening of a hold that had been maintained for a very long time. "Good," he said, and then he smiled again, the real one, the one that rearranged his face. They came into the outskirts of Santa Fe in the early afternoon of the following day. The city spread below them in the bright winter light, the old adobe buildings golden and low against the mountains behind them. It was a sight that should have been purely beautiful, and it was, but it was also tense with everything it represented. At the edge of town, Emmett drew Argent to a halt and sat for a moment, looking at the city below. "Creed has people here," he said. "Eyes. He will know we have arrived shortly after we arrive." "Then we should not waste time," Josephine said. He looked at her with that particular combination of surprise and recognition that she was beginning to identify as the expression of a man who keeps being reminded that she is exactly who she is. "No," he agreed. "We should not." The federal marshal's office was on the north side of the plaza, a modest building with a flag out front that seemed, in the afternoon light, like a statement of intent. They went directly there, and Emmett helped Josephine down from the saddle and they walked in together. The federal marshal was a man named Thomas Bowen, compact and clear-eyed and somewhere in his mid-40s, with the particular steadiness of someone who had been sent to a complicated place by a government that expected results. He stood when they came in, assessed them both quickly and without obvious judgment. "Emmett Thatcher," Emmett said, and he set the leather case he had been carrying in his saddlebag on the marshal's desk. "I have documents and a prepared testimony regarding Vernon Creed's operations in this territory over the past 6 years, including fraud, murder for hire, and corruption of local law enforcement." Marshal Bowen looked at the case. He looked at Emmett. He looked at Josephine. "And you are," he said to her. "Josephine Hale," she said. "A witness to the interception of Mr. Thatcher on the road from Las Vegas by 3 men acting on Mr. Creed's instructions, attempting to recover these documents by force." She set her own account on the desk, the notes she had made in neat handwriting during the storm in Mora, dates and names and descriptions. "I have also sent a prior letter to your office with the same information." Marshal Bowen sat down. He opened the leather case and looked at the first document, and then the second, and then he looked up at Emmett with an expression that was controlled but not entirely able to contain a certain satisfaction. "Sit down," the marshal said. "Both of you." They sat. The meeting lasted 3 hours. It was detailed, and at times grueling, Emmett providing the full history with a precision and clarity that spoke to how long he had been organizing this account, Josephine corroborating the events she had witnessed. Marshal Bowen asked sharp questions and took careful notes, and twice sent a deputy out for more coffee. By the time they walked out of the marshal's office into the late afternoon light of Santa Fe, Vernon Creed's protection in the territory was compromised. It would not happen overnight, Bowen had told them. These things took time, federal process was not fast, and Creed was resourceful and connected, but the foundation had been laid. The case was real and documented, and in the hands of someone who was not under Creed's influence, and the information could no longer be suppressed by simply removing Emmett Thatcher from the picture. They stood outside the marshal's office in the plaza, both slightly dazed by the sudden absence of urgency, by the fact of having arrived, of having accomplished the thing that had been driving everything. "It is done," Josephine said. "The first part of it," Emmett said. "The rest is Bowen's work." She looked at the plaza around them, the old city going about its late afternoon business, vendors and riders and children, the smell of piñon smoke and the thin high-altitude cold. It was beautiful. She had come here to begin again, and here she was, standing at the beginning. She thought about Clara Moss and the bookkeeping job and the life she had planned to build in this city. It was still the plan. It was still what she intended. She was practical, and she knew that a conversation on a trail and a smile by a campfire were not the same as a life, and that the practical next step was to find Clara and settle in. But when she turned to look at Emmett beside her, he was looking at her with a directness that made the practical next step feel temporarily distant. "Where will you go?" she said. "I have not booked lodging yet," he said. "I was not certain until today that I would make it this far." She thought about that. The dark, particular courage of a man who had ridden toward a goal he could not be certain of reaching. "Clara Moss is expecting me," she said. "I should send word." She paused. "But before I do, I wonder if you would have supper with me tonight. As a first call, if you like, or simply as two people who have shared a considerable amount of road." The corner of his mouth moved. "I would like both of those things," he said. They found a restaurant near the plaza, a proper one with linen tablecloths and actual glassware, the kind of establishment that Josephine had not sat in since Galveston. They ate slowly and they talked, and they were not rushed by anything for the first time since the creek bank, and the strangeness of that, the luxury of it, was something she could feel in her body as a physical relief. He told her about the witness he had arranged, a man named Garcia who had been a bookkeeper for Creed's operation and had grown a conscience and been willing to testify. Garcia was already in Santa Fe, under the marshal's protection. Emmett had arranged this through a series of careful letters over the previous year, and the coordination of it, managed from a distance, under a false name, while appearing to be nothing more than a drifter, struck her as remarkable. "You are considerably more organized than you appear," she said. "That was by design," he said. "I know," she said. "I am complimenting the design." He accepted the compliment with a slight ducking of his head that she found, to her own surprise, endearing. He walked her to Clara Moss's house after supper, the city quiet around them in the cold night air, the stars overhead in the high-altitude darkness enormous and close. At the gate of Clara's house he stopped, and they faced each other on the narrow street. "I will call on you tomorrow," he said, "if that is still all right." "It is," she said. He reached out and with two fingers briefly touched the back of her hand. It was the smallest of gestures, and she felt it from her hand to the center of her chest. "Good night, Josephine Hale," he said. "Good night, Emmett Thatcher," she said. She went inside. Clara Moss, who was small and warm and delighted to see her, immediately noted that Josephine looked different than her letters had suggested she would, which was to say that she looked like someone whose interior weather had recently changed. "Tell me everything," Clara said, putting the kettle on. Josephine sat down at her friend's kitchen table and told her. Not everything, not all of it, but enough. And when she got to the part about the blanket and the 5 words, Clara set down her teacup and looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who knows what is beginning. "He sounds like a good man," Clara said. "He is complicated," Josephine said. "The good ones are," Clara said simply. Emmett called on her the next afternoon, having found lodging at a decent establishment near the marshal's office where he could remain available as Bowen's process unfolded. He came to Clara's house with his hat in his hands, and was politely received by Clara, who offered coffee, and had the social grace to find a reason to be in another room after precisely 15 minutes. They sat in Clara's small parlor, and they were suddenly, surprisingly, awkward with each other in the way that people are when the urgency that has been holding them together is replaced by ordinary social circumstance. On the trail, there had been no awkwardness, because the situation had demanded directness. Here, in a parlor with lace curtains and a fire in the hearth, the conventions reasserted themselves, and neither of them quite knew how to navigate the gap between what they had been on the road and what they were supposed to be now. It was Emmett who solved it, after a stilted exchange about the weather. "This is strange," he said. "Is," she said with such relief that they both almost laughed. "I am better on a horse than in a parlor," he said. "I am better when there is something at stake," she said, and then she heard what she had said and qualified it. "I mean not at stakes in the dangerous way, I mean when there is something real happening." "I know what you mean," he said, "and I agree." So, he set down his coffee cup. "Let me be direct. I have never been a man who had much, in terms of place or stability or prospects. I have been working towards something for a long time, and that thing is now in the hands of the right people, which means that, for the first time in years, I have no defined direction. That is terrifying in its own way, and also, for the first time, it feels like a possibility. She waited. I would like the possibility to include you, he said, not in a theoretical way, in a real way that takes time and is properly done. I know I have little to offer in conventional terms. She looked at him levelly. I had a husband who offered everything in conventional terms, she said. I am not looking for conventional. He held her gaze. What are you looking for? He said. She thought about it honestly. Someone who stops, she said, when they see something that requires stopping. Someone who tells me the truth even when it is complicated. Someone who, she paused, choosing, sees me as an intelligence rather than an inventory item. I can do all of those things, he said without arrogance, just with the flat certainty of a man making an honest assessment. I know, she said. I have been watching. The spring came to Santa Fe slowly, the cold releasing its hold in stages, the mountains losing their snow inch by inch, the days lengthening and brightening. Josephine had begun work at the mercantile establishment, which was run by a man named Hector Vance, who was terse and demanding, and also genuinely pleased to have found someone who could manage his accounts with the precision she brought to them. Within 3 weeks she had reorganized his entire filing system and found 2 errors in his previous year's accounts that, corrected, saved him a significant amount of money. You have a gift for this, Vance told her, not effusively, but with the sincerity of a man who values competence above sentiment. I have a talent for it, she corrected. The gift is applied attention. He blinked at her and then said, whatever you call it, double your salary from next month. Emmett visited regularly, calling on her properly at Clara's house 3 times a week and on better weather days, taking her walking through the city or riding on the roads south of town where the land opened up and the sky was vast. He was still Emmett, still spare with words and careful with everything, but the careful management was loosening, incrementally, the way ice loosens in a warming river. She saw more of the person beneath the managed surface, the dry humor that appeared without warning, the genuine pleasure he took in her opinions on things, the way he read her face when she spoke as if he was memorizing something he did not want to lose. Marshal Bowen made his arrests in March. Vernon Creed was taken into federal custody on a Thursday morning, along with 2 of his associates, including the red-bearded man from the road. The news went through Santa Fe with the particular velocity of information in a small city, and that evening Emmett knocked on Clara's door with a bottle of wine he had clearly selected with care, and an expression that contained more relief than she had ever seen him allow himself. Clara poured the wine and they sat around the kitchen table, all 3 of them, and Emmett told the story of 6 years to a woman who had not heard it, and Clara listened with her characteristic combination of warmth and sharp intelligence. Will you testify? Clara asked him. At the trial? Yes, he said. The marshal wants me available. It will be some months before the trial is arranged. And after that? Clara asked and looked at Josephine in a way that was transparently not subtle. After that, Emmett said, looking at Josephine as well, I intend to stop drifting. Clara got up to check on something in the other room that did not need checking on. Stop drifting where? Josephine said. Here ideally, he said, if there is reason to. What sort of reason are you describing? He reached across the table and took her hand, his large, calloused, scarred hand over hers, and she felt the same warmth she had felt in the street outside Clara's gate on the first night, amplified now by weeks of knowing him more completely. The permanent kind, he said. She looked at their hands. I am not going to pretend that I am not afraid of that, she said. I have done permanent before, and it was not what I thought it would be. I know, he said, and I am not asking you to be unafraid. I am asking you to consider that 2 afraid people can be afraid together and still end up somewhere worth being. She looked at him. This man who had ridden through cold and dark and danger with his secrets and his evidence and his long, patient, solitary purpose. This man who had stopped, who had given her his blanket, who had seen worse cold and survived it and who was now sitting across from her in a warm kitchen in Santa Fe, offering her the rest of it. "Ask me properly," she said. He stood up from his chair. He went around the table. He crouched down beside her chair so that he was looking up at her, which put him at a disadvantage, which was deliberate, she understood, this man who was always careful about position. "Josephine Hale," he said, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" She looked down at his face, the grave gray eyes, the lines of it, the complexity of everything behind it. "Yes," she said, "I will." He rose and she stood, and he put his arms around her for the first time, properly, entirely, and she felt the same solid, unapologetic reality of him that she had felt on the back of his horse, the warmth of a person who was genuinely and completely present. She put her face against his shoulder and breathed. Clara came back into the room 45 seconds later and announced she had guessed exactly what had happened and was entirely pleased, and there was more wine opened. They were married in June of 1882, in the small church 2 blocks from the plaza, with Clara and her husband James standing as witnesses and Hector Vance in attendance, as a gesture of workplace respect that he would not have characterized as sentimental, but absolutely was. Josephine wore a blue dress the color of the New Mexico sky, and Emmett wore a coat that actually fit him, which represented a significant personal investment. The ceremony was brief, and the words were the traditional ones, and when the minister pronounced them married and Emmett took her hand and looked at her, she thought that she understood something for the first time about why these rituals existed, not because the words changed anything real, but because they made public and permanent what had already been true in every way that mattered. They found a house on the eastern edge of Santa Fe, a proper adobe with a courtyard and a room that Emmett turned into a study, and filled, over the following months, with a shelf of books that grew steadily wider. He had found work as an investigator for Marshal Bowen's office, his particular skills and his knowledge of the territory making him genuinely valuable in ways that were legal and structured, and provided both income and the occasional chance to do the kind of work that required him to sit with his back to the wall in small rooms and read people carefully. He was good at it. She was not surprised. Josephine continued at Vance's Mercantile through the summer and into the fall, and by the time the aspen leaves were turning gold in the mountains, she had been offered a junior partnership in the accounting function, which amounted to a formalization of what she was already doing, and an acknowledgement that Vance could not run the business without her. She accepted with the flat calm of a woman who had done the arithmetic beforehand. The trial of Vernon Creed opened in October of 1882 and lasted 6 weeks, which was a long time for a frontier court, but not surprising given the volume of evidence. Emmett testified over 3 days, clear and precise and unshakable under cross-examination from Creed's lawyer, who was competent and tried hard. Josephine sat in the gallery on the days he testified and watched him and thought about the 6 years of collected evidence, the patience of it, the long solitary purpose, and felt something in her chest that had grown steadily from the first night by the campfire and showed no sign of stopping. Creed was convicted on 4 counts of fraud, 2 counts of murder for hire, and 1 count of corruption of a public officer. The sentence was 20 years in the federal penitentiary, which Creed received with the expression of a man who had not genuinely believed this outcome was possible until the words were spoken. It was possible. It had happened. The small, unhistorical acts of multiple people, a drifter with evidence and a woman with a letter and a bookkeeper with a conscience and a marshal with integrity, had combined into something that changed the territory in ways that would take years to fully understand. They celebrated the verdict quietly, at home, with a bottle of wine and supper that Josephine cooked, and the particular satisfaction of 2 people who have seen something through to its end. "How do you feel?" she asked him when they were sitting by the fire afterward. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the flames with an expression that she had learned to read, the expression of a man taking internal inventory. "Lighter," he said finally. I feel lighter than I have felt in years." She reached across and took his hand. "Good," she said. "You have been carrying a lot." "We both have," he said. "We both have," she agreed. "But we are not carrying it alone anymore." He turned and looked at her, and his expression was one she had not seen before. Not quite. It was the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not fully believe he would reach. Not surprised exactly, because surprise implies doubt. Something more like wonder. "No," he said. "We are not." He pulled her toward him, and she went, and they sat by the fire in the warm room with the winter coming back outside, and she thought about creek banks and blankets and 5 words that had contained a biography, and about how the most important things rarely announce themselves. They just arrive, cold and ordinary and extending an offer. By the spring of 1883, Josephine knew she was expecting a child. She told Emmett on a Sunday morning in the courtyard, where they had taken to drinking their coffee when the weather allowed, the adobe walls warm in the early sun. He went very still when she told him, the kind of still that is the opposite of blankness, the kind that is full to overflowing. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said. Not congratulations, not excitement, but the fundamental question of her well-being, which was so completely him that she had to look away for a moment, because the love she felt was almost difficult to contain in an ordinary body. "I am very well," she said. "I am strong, and the doctor says everything is as it should be." He exhaled, and then he smiled, the real one, the wide one, the one that she had seen perhaps a dozen times in the year they had been together, and that each time felt like something rare. He came around the small table and crouched beside her chair again, the same way he had when he proposed, putting himself at the disadvantage, and he took her hand in both of his. "I am going to be a very imperfect father," he said. "I know," she said. "You are going to be wonderful." "Josephine," he said. "The two things are not incompatible," she said. He pressed his forehead briefly to her hand, a gesture so private she felt she was witnessing something usually kept entirely interior, and she put her other hand on the back of his neck. Their son was born in November of 1883, during a storm that covered the mountains in early snow and kept Emmett pacing the courtyard for 4 hours, until the midwife came to the door and told him he could come in. Josephine, who had decided that if she had gotten through the last several years, she could certainly get through childbirth, had been entirely right, and also found it considerably harder than she had expected, and was not going to tell Emmett either of these things. The boy was healthy and loud, and had, when Emmett held him for the first time and looked down at his face, the most overwhelmed expression Josephine had ever seen on a human being. "What do you want to name him?" Josephine said from the bed, tired to her foundations and entirely happy. Emmett looked up from the baby. His eyes were bright. "Samuel," he said, "after no one, just because it sounds like someone who can carry something." "Samuel Thatcher," she said. Yes. It did sound like someone who could carry something. It sounded like someone who would be all right in a difficult world. Samuel grew at the rate babies grow, which is to say startlingly fast, and by the time he was walking, he was already showing the characteristic combination of his parents' traits that made both of them privately delighted. He had Emmett's gray eyes and Josephine's determination, and a temperament that was curious about everything and afraid of nothing, which Emmett viewed as a significant responsibility and Josephine viewed as a matter of good influence and clear example. Emmett had proven himself an imperfect and wonderful father in exactly the ways Josephine had predicted. He was patient in the way that people with deep reserves of patience are, and he read to Samuel with the seriousness he brought to everything. He was awkward with the ordinary social aspects of fatherhood in ways that gradually became less awkward. He made mistakes and acknowledged them without drama. He was there completely in the solid and unapologetic way that was his fundamental nature. There were days when the dark past pressed forward, not in any dramatic way, but in the ordinary way that the past does, emerging in a nightmare that left him sitting up at 3 in the morning, in a heaviness that settled over him sometimes when he was reading, in the occasional careful distance that his eyes went to when a particular kind of memory was close. Josephine learned the geography of these moments the way she had learned everything about him, by watching closely, and she learned what they required, which was usually not words but presence, the simple fact of her being there. She had her own pressing past, the 3 years with Clarence, the particular damage of being systematically unseen. There were days when the old wariness returned, when she tested the temperature of the room for signs of indifference, when she caught herself measuring her own visibility as if it might disappear. Emmett learned to recognize these moments too, and what he did in them was always some version of the same thing. He looked at her. Directly and completely, the way he had looked at her across the campfire on the first night, as if she was something worth the entire attention. It always worked. In 1885, Josephine was offered a full partnership in the accounting business by Hector Vance, who was preparing to retire and wanted the enterprise to continue under capable management. She accepted, and over the following year expanded the operation to include 2 additional clients, one of them the territorial government, whose accounts had not been kept with anything resembling consistency, and which represented a significant opportunity for someone with both mathematical precision and the patience of a woman who had survived Creed's territory and all that came before it. The business grew. The house grew, an addition to the west wall of the courtyard that gave Samuel a proper room and created a larger sitting room for the household. The shelf of books grew until it required a second shelf and then a third, and they read to each other in the evenings after Samuel was asleep, alternating who chose the book, which meant that Emmett's history and Josephine's novels existed side by side and informed each other in ways that gave both of them new angles on the things they already thought they understood. Emmett continued with the marshal's office until Marshal Bowen retired in 1886, at which point he transitioned to independent investigation work that allowed him to take or decline cases according to his own judgment, which suited him considerably better than institutional employment. He was good at it and he was fair at it, and there were people across the territory who could tell you, if asked, about a gray-eyed man who had helped them in a difficult situation with the same basic methodology. He stopped when stopping was required. She had told him that once, that he was a man who stopped. He had been quiet for a moment and then he had said, "I learned what it costs not to." She had thought about that for a long time. Their second child arrived in the spring of 1887, a daughter this time, born in the May warmth with the courtyard full of flowers. They named her Eliza, from the same impulse that had named Samuel, because it sounded like someone who would be all right. Eliza was, from the beginning, a different sort of creature than Samuel, quieter in some respects and louder in others, interested in the physical world with an intensity that kept her parents occupied, and her older brother in a permanent state of either companionship or exasperation. Samuel, who was 4 when Eliza was born, stood next to Josephine's bed the day after the birth and looked at his sister with the particular expression of a child confronting a major rearrangement of the world. "Is she going to stay?" he asked. "She is going to stay," Josephine confirmed. He considered this for a long moment. Then he went to Emmett and lifted his arms to be picked up, and Emmett picked him up and Samuel put his small head against his father's shoulder and looked at Eliza from that height and said, with the authority of a 4-year-old who has decided something, "All right, all right," the 2 words that contained a world. On a January morning in 1888, exactly 6 years after the creek bank, Josephine woke early and went into the courtyard while the house was still quiet. Santa Fe in January still had a particular cold, a clear and bright cold, nothing like the killing cold of the mountains, but enough to make her breath visible. She stood in the courtyard and looked at the sky, which was beginning to lighten in the east behind the mountains, and she thought about a frozen creek bank and a gray horse and a man with a battered hat who had reached behind him and held out a blanket without ceremony. She thought about the 5 words, Take it, I have seen worse cold, the biography in them, the dark past in them. The person who had survived things speaking plainly to the person who had not yet survived this particular thing. The offer of something small and practical that turned out to be the beginning of everything. She heard the door behind her and turned. Emmett stood in the doorway in the cold, wearing his coat over his nightshirt, his hair still disordered from sleep, his feet in boots he had not stopped to lace. His gray eyes found her, and the expression on his face was the fully revealed version of the expression she had first seen in the firelight on that first night, the one she had been watching develop from suppressed to open over the years. He crossed the courtyard to her. "You are up early," he said, his voice rough with sleep. 6 years ago today, she said. He did not need her to specify. He stood beside her and they both looked east at the lightning sky. "I have been thinking about what you said when you testified," she said. "About the period before you collected the evidence. About what it felt like to know you had been used for something you had not agreed to." "What about it?" he said. "You said you spent a long time being angry at yourself instead of at Creed," she said. "Because Creed felt too big and the anger at yourself was more manageable." "Yes," he said. "I did the same thing," she said. "About Clarence, about the marriage and what it became. I spent years being angry at myself for not being someone different, rather than at the situation that was genuinely not my fault." She looked at him. "I think we both had to come a long distance to get to a place where we could stop doing that." He looked at her for a long moment. The sky was lighter now, turning faintly rose and gold above the mountains. "We did," he said. "I am glad we got here," she said. He reached out and put his arm around her in the cold courtyard and pulled her against his side, the solid warmth of him the same as it had always been, constant and unapologetic and real. "So am I," he said. "Every day." They stood together in the early light and watched the sun come over the mountains, and Eliza called from inside the house in the particular imperative tone of an 8-month-old who has assessed the situation and found it wanting. And Samuel, who was old enough to be a limited help with his sister, went to her first, because he was his parents' child in the most essential way, and he understood that when something required attending to, you attended to it. Josephine laughed at the sound of them, her 2 children in the warm room behind her. Emmett smiled into her hair. The sun came fully over the mountains, filling the courtyard with cold, bright light. Everything was, in every way that could be counted and in many ways that could not be, exactly all right. It was more than all right. It was the life 2 people build when they have each survived the things they were not sure they would survive, and have found each other on the other side of it, and have decided, with open eyes and full knowledge of the cost, that the building is worth doing. It was the life that had begun with a blanket on a frozen creek bank in the New Mexico Territory in January of 1882. It was the life that would continue to be built, day by quiet day, in the high-altitude light of Santa Fe, by a man who had learned to stop and a woman who had learned to take the offered hand, both of them carrying the past and choosing the future with the same determined clarity, the kind that only comes from people who know exactly how dark things can get and have chosen the light anyway. Samuel learned to read at 4, ahead of expectations, and read everything he could find, including the shelf in his father's study which he was technically allowed to access only with permission, and which he accessed constantly without it. He had a particular affinity for history, which made his father proud in a way that he expressed by saying very little and showing Samuel maps. Eliza learned to walk early and run earlier, and by the time she was 2, she had escaped the courtyard on 3 separate occasions and been retrieved from various neighboring locations, with the patient exasperation of parents who have come to terms with the particular character of a second child. Josephine's accounting practice had, by 1890, expanded to include 4 full-time employees and contracts with the territorial government, and 2 of the largest commercial enterprises in Santa Fe. She had become, quietly and without particular fanfare, one of the most respected commercial minds in the city, which she acknowledged with the same flat practicality with which she acknowledged everything. She had a talent. She applied it. Results followed. Emmett had also by 1890 acquired a reputation of a different kind. Not notorious but known, the way a reliable thing becomes known in a community. People who had complicated problems and needed someone with good judgment, and no particular personal stakes in the comfortable answer came to him. He was fair and he was thorough, and he was honest about what he found even when what he found was not what the client had hoped, which was the kind of reputation that is worth more over time than any other kind. They had an ordinary life in the best possible sense of the word ordinary. They had disagreements that were resolved with the combination of stubbornness and honesty that characterized both of them. They had evenings by the fire with books and evenings in the courtyard watching the stars. They had holidays that were uneven in quality and Sundays that were reliably peaceful and mornings that were consistently busy, because Samuel and Eliza together generated a quantity of noise and energy that kept the household from any tendency toward complacency. On the evening of their 10th anniversary, Emmett and Josephine sat in the courtyard after the children were in bed, the summer night warm and full of the sounds of the city around them, and Emmett said, looking at the stars, "I have been thinking about what to give you." "You do not need to give me anything," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to, and what I want to give you is not a thing. It is a question." She looked at him. "Is there anything," he said carefully, "anything at all that you want that you do not have, that I could give you or that we could build together?" She sat with this question, taking it seriously because he had asked it seriously. She thought about the bookkeeping practice and the adobe house and the courtyard full of summer stars. She thought about Samuel with his nose in a history book, and Eliza with mud on her dress from the garden that she had claimed to be not her fault in terms that were both creative and implausible. She thought about the evening readings and the morning coffee and the solid weight of Emmett's arm across her in the night. She thought about the frozen creek bank. "More of this," she said, "just more of exactly this." He reached over and took her hand. "That," he said, "I can give you." He brought her hand up and held it against the side of his face for a moment, a gesture she recognized as one of his most private ones, the kind he made when words were not sufficient but something needed to be communicated. She understood it. She had always been good at receiving what he was sending. The stars were enormous overhead, the way they are only in high desert places far from the noise of the world. Below them, in the warm house, their son was almost certainly reading past his bedtime with a candle, because he was his parents' child, and he had learned that some things were worth the discomfort of the attempt. And somewhere to the north, the mountains stood cold and white and vast, holding in their indifference the frozen creek bank and the gray horse and the 5 words in the blanket, holding the beginning of the thing that had become this life, this warm and complicated and utterly real life. The drifter had stopped. The woman had taken the blanket. Neither of them had ever had cause to regret it. And the night was warm, and the stars were close, and they held each other's hands in the courtyard of the house they had built together, and everything that had been opened was answered, and everything that had been broken was mended, and the story that had begun in cold was ending, years and years later, in all the warmth that 2 people can build when they are brave enough to start.